saw a familiar face walking on the avenue. Both surprised by the way we looked. The years had changed us too. We smiled and both embraced like old friends often do.
Hello again. Welcome to a new episode of Gung. It's December 21st. I'm a little sick. I guess you could realize that. And I'm here with Frank Romeo.
Correct.
All right. And this is our fourth show, and we're going to keep going. And it's about PTSD and the American soldier and how we could help people before they actually go in. Educate them somehow. I don't know. All right. You want to tell the people how we got into Vietnam?
Well, in retrospect, the war in Southeast Asia was not just an American war. We got into it. The world got us into it. The United Nations, at the end of the Korean War, at the Geneva Accords and the Geneva Convention of 1954, the world came together and redefined the boundaries of Southeast Asia. As if they couldn't take care of their own countries, the Geneva Accords restated the boundaries of Laos and Vietnam and perpetrated and really started civil wars in both Laos and Vietnam. They redefined the boundaries as opposed to just making one country. They made two countries, and they set up new parameters, new boundaries in Southeast Asia. They also opened up the Mekong River to harnessing electricity. And they had the Mekong River Project, which opened up capitalism to come into Southeast Asia, and of course the United States was one of the first countries there. There were many countries involved in the Mekong River Project bidding for hydroelectric power. So the United States and President Kennedy were the first ones to go in there and send advisors there, set up a mock government, and bring capitalism into Southeast Asia. And that really extended from the Geneva Convention in 1954. And that ended the war in Indochina and ended the Korean War also. And also ended French occupation. The French were kicked out at that point.
And for some reason, we decided to pick up where they left. What were we doing?
We picked up where the French had left off. The French was there since the 1800s, 1880s. And Southeast Asia, they were a protectorate, and that was part of their commonwealth in Southeast Asia. And the French were there. The French architecture is still there. I visited Little Hanoi and Old Hanoi, and the French architecture, the French influence is still very, there in Southeast Asia. And so other than World War II, when the French had all they could do with Hitler and Germany invading France, they dropped the ball on Southeast Asia. And the Japanese took over. Then the Japanese came in. We have the bridge over River Kwai. We have all different campaigns to build a railroad, the Death Railway from Bangkok up north into Laos and from the Gulf of Thailand. So other than those few years that the Japanese were there, it was the French, then it was the Japanese, and then of course the United States and the Soviet Union and China came into the area.
Do you think the CIA played a significant role in what was going on there?
The CIA played a significant role in everything that was happening in Southeast Asia, because simultaneously as we had the Vietnam War, we also had the secret wars. And they call it the secret wars because no one talked about it. The United States and Russia had made a deal. Kennedy and Khrushchev made a deal to stay out of each other's affairs in Laos. That meant militarily. So to circumvent that, they sent the CIA in. And never before in the history of the United States, the ambassador to Laos was actually running the war. The ambassador had missions. The ambassador had B-52 bombing mission power, and he was running the war in Laos. And the war in Laos, the civil war in Laos, ran simultaneously hand in hand with the war in Vietnam. They started at the same time. They ended within 6 months of each other.
I just finished a book called what? President Kennedy and the Assassination of him by the CIA. And the book's premise is that before DM was killed, Kennedy had put out a national security memo, action memo, and it was dealing with getting out completely. And when he got killed, Lyndon Johnson completely reversed it.
Well, there were so many countries involved in it, and the domino effect, and they had what they called the More Flags campaign. And Kennedy had met with the Australian Prime Minister, and they talked about Southeast Asia, and they talked about communism spreading throughout Southeast Asia. And they felt in the Pacific Rim, they felt if Southeast Asia fell to communism, so too with the rest of the Pacific Rim. And they had this deal, and then they started what they called the More Flags campaign to try to get more countries involved. So they spun it in the media as democracy against communism, good against evil, and it was portrayed that way. Yet, in fact, they never talked about the Mekong River Project. They never talked about going there, all these countries going there to harness the Mekong River. That was a big part of being in Southeast Asia, and we don't talk about that. And the secret wars we don't talk about. And that was a war that really affected the entire country of Laos. Laos is the most bombed country per capita in the history of the world. And in the ground now, I've visited Laos. I've been to the bomb fields. There are approximately 200,000 unexploded American bombs still in the ground in Laos, in the Plain of Jars. And I've visited there. I've interviewed the workers there.
And I would assume that a good amount of them get killed and wounded.
That's the problem. When you have a poor society, when you find some of these workers out in the fields, when they find an unexploded 500-pound bomb, that's just scrap metal alone. The money they make in scrap metal alone feeds their family for a long time.
500-pound bomb.
They're all over. It's
And,
amazing to see them.
And I think we were also dropping 1,000-pound bombs.
You cannot believe. There's a town called Pansavon, Laos, and I visited it. And it's the most unique town in all the world because the entire architecture of this town is American bombs, unexploded bombs. When you go into the hotel, the front desk is made of 300-pound bombs cut in half. When you go to the cafe, the table and the benches are 300-pound bombs cut in half and turned upside down. The planters are cluster bombs. The entire architecture of this town is unexploded American bombs.
So I think you mentioned this before, that Laos was the most bombed country ever.
Yeah.
And also at the same time, Kennedy made a decision to use Agent Orange.
Yes.
In 1962.
Yes. Well, the mentality of our government, the Vietnam War and the secret wars, the mentality of our government was, if the enemy's going to hide in the jungle, let's kill the jungle and deprive them of a hiding place. So let's spray Southeast Asia with a herbicide so powerful it will kill the jungle. There were tracts of land the size of Massachusetts where nothing grows. Now, that was sprayed in the jungle, that was sprayed in the plants. I was there, you were there, we ate the vegetables, we drank the water. You know, I'm contaminated with Agent Orange, you're contaminated with Agent
Waded
Orange.
through the streams, bathed in the rivers, all this shit.
Yeah, yeah. And that was all part of the war that no one talks about. Now we talk about it. But
I saw an article when Kennedy and his advisors, the best and the brightest, were talking about whether or not they should use Agent Orange. and someone said, it's a chemical weapon. And,
It's true.
and then someone said, no, it's not. We're not going to use it on humans or people,
Yeah.
so it's not.
Yeah. Well, when I when I went back to Southeast Asia, there's an entire generation of paraplegics, of children born with no arms and legs. There are money box drops in all the airports and all the tourist attractions with pictures of children with no arms and legs from Agent Orange, and donation boxes for money.
Would you bring those photos in to show us?
Sure, sure.
A lot of my buddies have been affected by Agent Orange, actually being killed off by Agent
Yeah,
Orange.
no doubt. It's a serious problem. There's so many serious problems that Vietnam veterans are facing now that we're old. Hepatitis C. They injected us. They used the same needle for 100 guys. And if one guy was infected, they just went down the line. They didn't use individual needles. They used the needle gun they did in the Army. I don't know what they did in the Marines, but they just went down the arm and inoculated us with the same gun.
I think what they did is we passed by and they used the same needle.
Yeah, I mean, really. So we had.
I'm sorry. All right. We really, my generation got really fooled, I would say. Of course, when we heard Kennedy say, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, all the young men, and I was very young, he was calling us to go to Southeast Asia and stop communism.
It was the perfect storm, okay? You have you have the Mekong River Project. You have communism, you have democracy, you have good, you have evil, you have all these countries involved, okay? And then, what people don't realize, never in the history of the world had so many men turned 18 as the baby boomers. In the mid-60s, our entire generation of men turned 18. It was the largest manpower pool in the history of human beings. What better way to have a draft? What better way to force a war, to fund a war, to get the soldiers for it? It was the largest manpower pool in the history of human beings. We turned 18 in the mid-60s.
Well, I was a little older than you. I actually had, they gave me some deferments because I was in college. As soon as I finished college, then I got a draft notice.
Right.
But I preempted that by volunteering for the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
And that started me on an incredible path, I would say.
Yeah, right.
But when they were training us, I don't remember them saying anything about the North Vietnamese Army. They were talking about the Viet Cong all the time.
Right, right.
And
They didn't actually realize that North Vietnam had an army.
how could they not realize that?
Well, they were going there saying it's a guerrilla warfare. They portrayed it as being a guerrilla warfare, which in fact it was, but people don't realize there were actually regiments and
Divisions, actually.
divisions of soldiers in uniform that were well trained, that had helmets and guns and uniforms and boots, and that looked just like us, only, on the other side.
They were a little small.
That was the only difference. They were a little shorter than us.
So we went over there, and we think we're going to fight the Viet Cong, and we wind up fighting the North Vietnamese Army. And they were all over, up and down, South Vietnam.
Yeah.
And that's basically what we did. Our encounter with Viet Cong was minimal. Almost everything we did was North Vietnamese Army.
Yeah.
And they were on the ground. They outgunned us. They had better weapons than we had.
Yeah.
They had the AK-47.
The AK-47 is an amazing assault rifle. The original first M16s were garbage. Mine jammed all the time. I had a patrol to actually dive down into the Mekong River, and it was so muddy you couldn't see 6 inches below water level. It was full of that rich silt coming down from China. And weapons, they would hide weapons under the water because no one could see them. So my job was to dive down. One of my jobs was to dive down to the bottom of this river and come up with these weapons. Well, I came up with this AK-47. There were hundreds of them down there, but I came up with an AK-47. It had been packed with mud. That it fired. I took it out. We actually just started shooting in the air with it, and it actually fired. The M16, if I got one grain of sand in it, wouldn't work. Mine wouldn't work.
Anyhow, about the North Vietnamese Army, I read one book on my way over to Vietnam, Bernard Fall, The Street Without Joy, and the way he explained it, there were really large units of the Viet Minh, and they beat the shit out of the French. And then finally they surrounded them at Dien Bien Phu. But these were large units. These weren't Viet Cong guerrillas.
No,
And-
these were well-trained units, yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah, Ho
we-
Chi Minh had it together. Ho Chi Minh knew what he was doing. He was a brilliant statesman. He knew what he was doing. He knew he had an agenda. He had focus. He knew he had a mission, and he completed it. You know, and these are things. When I went back to Southeast Asia, and that's part of my education program, The Art of War, and I took it back there, and I visited. I studied PTSD from the former enemy. I met the Viet Cong. We had dinner. I met the North Vietnamese regular army, and we had dinner.
Do they actually realize that it's a mental illness that they have?
Yeah, yeah, they've come to terms. When we talk about PTSD at the military level, at the soldier level, the entire country has PTSD. We set back Southeast Asia 50 years with what we did there. This entire country, we vaporized 500,000 people. They can't account for 500,000. 500,000 people cannot be accounted for, left over from the Vietnam War. We just really had a big impact on that area of the world for many years. It was the longest running war in our history to date. Now, of course, we've surpassed that.
When we went over there, at first I believed we were doing the right thing, but early on I realized it was a lie, that you couldn't leave. You had to stay there and do it, do whatever you were told. But doesn't that have a serious effect on your mind when you know you're there and you don't believe in what you're doing?
I have, in my collection, in the Art of War collection, I have propaganda leaflets. I have propaganda leaflets from both sides. And Ho Chi Minh was so brilliant in his propaganda and his technique that he would drop leaflets, and they'd talk about, don't forget in the 60s, we're in the middle of the civil rights movement. And he would have these leaflets, and he would state that what we're doing to the African American, the KKK is doing, is what our soldiers are doing to their babies. And he would make reference to dark periods in American history and turn it around. So now when you have soldiers, psychologically, when you have soldiers that are questioning what they're doing, and they're reading these leaflets, and they're talking about African Americans fighting there, when in fact they can't even get respect back in their own country, and they're going through the civil rights movement, it has a big psychological effect. And Ho Chi Minh was brilliant at the psychological warfare. He used it against us. Everything we did, he used against us.
I call it the betrayal of us,
Well.
what they said to us about the war and what we were doing.
Yeah.
The great betrayal. But a lot of us had to just do it. And then we had to come home, and it was absolutely, this, there was nothing for us. We came out of the jungle, and 2 days later we were stateside.
That was it. Well, you're here and you're there, and that's it. And there was no detoxing. There was no. It was very difficult for many soldiers. An entire generation. I would say an entire generation of men went underground. I know that's how I created my programs, because of not having the outlet that they have today, not being able to talk about what we experienced. There was nowhere to go. There was no outreach programs. There was nothing.
And
They didn't even say thank you.
so we got a lot of us realized we were betrayed when we drank the lemonade about we're fighting communism. It was all bullshit. And then we come home, and the Americans hold it against us that we were over there.
Right.
And they don't understand. Most of us, came to the conclusion that this is not right.
Yeah.
This is not right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, these are the things I talk about with students, and these are the things when I lecture and I do my programs, and these are the things that students don't realize, and they cannot wrap their mind around how veterans were treated back then. They can't understand that today, and people forget that an entire generation of Vietnam veterans, you know, look what we're still doing. I mean, I'm still teaching, and I'm teaching about war. I'm teaching about the realities of war. I'm trying to help young people today to understand the concept of war.
well, it's only recently that the VA has come around and started doing treatment for the Vietnam veterans. This is all recent.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it never was. 20 years ago, it wasn't like this. No.
All right, talk a little bit about the education program.
Well, the Art of War is a program that I've been traveling around the country with for 30 years now, and I educate. I go into schools. I talk to students going into the military. One of my programs called the PTSD Generation, I went back to Southeast Asia, and I lived in a jungle all over again like I did 50 years ago. I lived in grass huts. I lived in the Mekong Delta. I lived in rice paddies. I met with a former enemy. We talked about their PTSD. I thought if I was going to educate, if I was going to understand PTSD, and if I was going to talk to young people about PTSD and about war, that I should know firsthand from the enemy side. I should get a grasp on how the enemy dealt with PTSD, and I did. And I met with former Viet Cong, as I said before, and I met with former North Vietnamese regular Army officers. I met with South Vietnamese officers. I visited bombed out areas like we talked about in Laos and Pantavan. I visited all the countries in Southeast Asia that were associated with the war. I went to Senator McCain's cell. I actually meditated for an entire afternoon in Senator McCain's cell in Hanoi at Halo Prison, better known as the Hanoi Hilton. I visited Way City, the Battle of Way City. I visited all the bombed out areas, and I stood in bomb craters. I slept in bomb craters that are still there 50 years later.
And they're really big.
You could put houses in it. You could put half your block inside one of these bomb craters, and there were thousands of these holes littering the countryside.
I hate when sometimes you fly in, you see all the shining things. They're actually the sun on the bomb craters, the water in the bomb craters.
Yeah, it was crystal clear water. It was beautiful water because it sat there, all the silt and everything went down to the bottom, and they're still there, you know. And unfortunately, and like the Plain of Jars in Laos, there's unexploded bombs in the same area, you know, and children play, and thousands of people have been killed just stepping on bombs that we left there. There's 200,000 unexploded bombs, an estimate. Princess Di was big on the bomb, on defusing the bomb, and then of course she passed away. But I've been to the bomb fields, and I visited them, and I interviewed the workers. There's no American companies there. They're all mostly based in the UK. And there's no American involvement to try to defuse these bombs. And they're all our bombs.
And what about anything going on about all the Agent Orange we left behind?
Yeah, the Agent Orange is a big factor there. The Agent Orange in all the areas we've been to are left behind. The residuals are there. There are still areas that things don't grow too well in because of Agent Orange. There's an entire generation of children that were born, of course they're adults now, that were born with no arms and legs and all birth defects, and that was due to Agent Orange.
I thought that was still happening.
Yeah, well, no, it's going into second generation now. Now I have 2 children born that are learning disabled, hearing impaired, auditory processing disorders. 2 of my children are born that way, and I'm contaminated. I'm on the registry. I sued Dow Chemicals, and I'm on the registry for Agent Orange, and you know, it goes to second generation. Now they're doing studies where it possibly skips a generation and goes to the third generation.
It had a lot of effect on veterans that came home and had children with their wives, a lot of mitzvah they call it, a lot of the fetuses were born dead or deformed.
Yeah, miscarried, sure.
Um,
Yeah, and we didn't think about it at the time, so I didn't connect the dots. I didn't think about it when I had children that were born, with this
Well, when you think
disability.
about it,
Now you did think about it.
yeah, but all you're doing is think about it. The government will never say that Agent Orange is affecting our children mentally, they're never going to say that.
Yeah. Well, it's like PTSD. When one person in the family suffers, you can almost call it contagious. When someone in the family suffers PTSD, so does the rest of the family. So you have a contagious effect that the entire family is going through an event, especially with these young soldiers today. They're coming back, and I get calls all the time about young soldiers that are angry, and they've gone through the stages, and they're putting guns in their car to go to work. They're doing things like that.
They're putting guns in their
Yeah,
cars.
Yeah, because they're paranoid.
That's not good.
No, it's not a good scenario. And these are stages of PTSD, and the hard part is to reach out to them, because denial, as you know, you would give into it. You wouldn't admit you had PTSD or you had something going wrong. I fought it for 20 years, 2 decades, just took drugs. And I worked and I buried myself in my work. And so denial is probably the beginning of the first
I
stages.
absolutely worked hard, played hard. I think that was some of the things that helped me get by for a while.
Line, 'cause friends are friends for all time.